This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. If you like us, please join our community of supporters by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find all about it on our homepage. I am Gilad Halpern, and every week my co-host Dalia Shenlin and I talk about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Dalia is away this week, and it is therefore my pleasure, and mine alone, to welcome Professor Dan Porat to the show. He is a historian affiliated with the Fox School of Education at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His book, Bitter Reckoning, Israel Tries Holocaust Survivors as Nazi Collaborators, has just been published in English by Harvard University Press. And to let our listeners know, the introduction of the book is accepted in Time Magazine and Yahoo News. Professor Dan Porat, hello and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So as you write in your book, between 1950 and 1972, some 40 former kapos stood trial in Israel, yet the story is almost entirely unknown. I like to think of myself as someone who's familiar with Israeli history, and I was unaware of every single name that you mention in the book. So you also say that you had to excavate some of the protocols seen by you for the first time. All this despite the fact that similar trials, namely of Rudolf Kastner in the 1950s and Adolf Eichmann in the early 1960s, took place very much in the public eye. How do you explain it?
Well, I was surprised by myself. I wasn't aware of these trials myself, having studied the Holocaust for the past 15 or so years. And I came upon this just by chance. Probably I even can't recollect accurately where I came upon them, but probably in the book of Tom Segev, The Seventh Million. The reasons that these trials have been forgotten, both by Israelis and by anyone else, I believe stem from a couple of possible reasons. One being that there was intentional censorship of these trials. If you walk through the 4,200 square meters of Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum, you will not see a word about these trials. Even if you go into the library or the archives and search, the material that the Yad Vashem has related to these trials is not available for public view. So that would be one reason. Also, the state archives, which holds most of the documents, held them back and did not allow them to be accessed for the past 40, 50 years or so. A second reason, I believe, is more important, which is a reason that it doesn't fit into our narrative of the Holocaust. We in Israel, much as a result of the Eichmann trial, came to see Jews justifiably as victims. But as part of that, we also eliminated from our collective memory the whole notion that any Jew could have collaborated in any way or form. And the fact that there were 40 such trials not only eludes the public in Israel, as I present in the epilogue of the book. I met with one of the prosecutors, an elderly woman, an 88-year-old, who was a prosecutor in the 1950s, then became a senior judge in Tel Aviv District Court. And when I began to speak with her about the trials in which she was the prosecutor of 4 of the trials, she said, "What trials are you talking about?" She had never heard about these trials, presumably. Only after I pulled out a document with her signature on it did she acknowledge that she herself was part of these trials. So there were both, I believe it's both systematic, organizational, or state censorship of this narrative, combined with a certain sense that it just doesn't fit into the collective narrative. I should just like to add one point, which is we must be aware that the Kastner trial was not one of the Kapo trials, whereas the Kapo trials were criminal trials against Jews who served as policemen or kapos in the ghettos, and they were sent to jail, 2/3 of them convicted and sent to jail. The Kastner trial was a civil trial, was not a civil trial, but it was mostly defamation trial against Malkiel Grunwald for his defamation of Kastner, and it is not one of these trials.
Who accused Kastner as a collaborator.
Correct.
Right. But, in terms of the, public discourse, it should have had this an enhancing effect on, the phenomenon of Jewish collaborators.
Well, in the 1940s and 1950s, this was a major topic. I mean, this was in the newspapers, and I bring hundreds of excerpts or references, I should say, to newspapers of the time, and this was a complete discussion. It was the Eichmann trial which largely brought an end to this, because finally Jews and Israelis understood who were the true culprits, and also Hausner in some...
The chief prosecutor.
The chief prosecutor in the Eichmann trial intentionally framed the Eichmann trial in part so as to dispel the idea as if Jews had collaborated and were part of the annihilation of the 6 million in Europe.
Is that your conclusion as a historian who interpreted the events, the facts, the documents that you came across? Or is it did you have any sort of smoking gun, as it were, an institutional paper saying, we've got to change the way, somewhere, expunge these trials from collective memory, from public knowledge?
Look, I think that as a historian, you will never find a document admitting that we want to expunge this from public memory. But when you add one to one, the fact that at Yad Vashem, the archive, this material is not on the public computers. If you add one to one, there was even a case where the person in charge of the National State Archives phoned one researcher, Professor Hanna Jablonka, and warned her not to use the material, which she by mistake came upon. So I don't know if that's a smoking gun, but it's as close as you can get to a smoking gun.
Right. So tell us how you excavated these materials, if they were, so far away from public access.
Well, that is there are different types of material that I collected here. There are materials that are of course, the protocols of the trial themselves, and Israel
Were they hard to come by?
Look, I should say I was able, out of the 40 or so trials, and I used the number 40 or so because I wasn't able to excavate all the material. But that's more due to lack, that some of them have just, I think for technical reasons, people haven't been able to locate them. But Israel legislated in the 1990s, I believe, a Freedom of Information Act, and that helped researchers like me, and there are a couple of others who also have touched on this and written books in Hebrew about it. We were able to file FOIA, which is Freedom of Information Act requests, and receive these protocols. There are also the materials related to newspapers and their archives abroad. So there were a few places to find this material, yes.
Yeah. So you identify 4 stages in that 20-odd years period. Can you take us through those stages and say how the discourse around Jewish collaborators of Nazis evolved over the years?
Sure. I think I'll point to the beginning and to the end, some and just slightly to the stages in between. But I will begin by the fact that the legislation of the Nazis and Nazi collaborators criminal law of 1950, on which the Eichmann trial was based, was basically a trial that was intended not for Eichmann. Nobody ever imagined that Eichmann will make Aliyah. But it was intended, first and foremost, so as to prosecute these Jews. Now, we need to understand the survivors were coming across people who tormented them in the camps, Jews who were policemen, Jews who were kapos, and it was a horrific scene. There is a case which doesn't leave my mind, of a woman in her 9th month of pregnancy arriving at Bellinson Hospital, ready to give birth, and she's screaming out of pain, and the midwife is screaming back at her that she was her capo and she surrendered her sisters and parents. So it was a very, very contentious and very difficult time. And people were looking for revenge, and they were looking for people who were responsible for this. And they viewed the Jewish leadership as the one who was responsible for this, what had come upon them. This legislation was needed so as to channel the violence that was in the streets of Israel, in buses, in wedding halls, and everywhere. People were pointing at each other. You killed my brother. You tormented me. You surrendered my sister, and so on. And the legislation came so as to basically box these people and move the violence into legitimate channels. But at this time, Jews who had served as functionaries in the camp were seen as Nazis, and even worse than Nazis. They were seen as people who had betrayed their nation. And in 1952, a death sentence was issued for one of these kapos, Yechezkel Jungster, in the Tel Aviv District Court. And immediately with that, the Tel Aviv District Prosecution, which up until then had sought death penalties for 14 of these alleged collaborators, understood that it had gone too far. And that basically was the first transition, the first change from seeing these Jews as Nazis or worse than Nazis to understanding that they did not deserve death. And from 1952 and on, they still were seen as Nazis, but not as worthy of death because the Nazis were worse than them.
We should also say that Jungster's death sentence was later overturned.
Correct. The Supreme Court overturned that death sentence within weeks of its being issued. The next stage came after the Kastner trial, when suddenly people understood the complexity of what collaboration really meant. Kastner, with the whole story there that is too complex for me now to discuss, but I would say that brought upon Chaim Cohen, the Attorney General at the time, the understanding that basically if a person collaborated with the Nazis with good intention, with intention of saving other Jews, with intention of even in some ways saving themselves and their family, but not out of an ideological identification, one should not prosecute them. So basically the number of prosecutions drops dramatically in the late 1950s. And the Eichmann trial and a following trial, a very major trial, I would say the most important trial in this set of trials, the Barenblatt trial, who was by chance the opera house conductor, was the shift for the final stage. In that trial, basically a young prosecutor who would later become Israel's justice minister, David Libai, attempted to walk back into a previous stage and basically to see anyone who was a member of the ghetto or of the Jewish police as somebody who had betrayed the nation. And the Supreme Court turned that down and said it's not appropriate to prosecute these people. The Supreme Court basically put an end to the trials with one exception. And the one exception was when a functionary, a capo, a policeman, treated his fellow Jews in a sadistic or a monstrous way, they should be prosecuted. And the last trial was a case like that in 1972. And with that, the trials came to an end.
Because there were no more potential defendants, or did the law just turn into a dead letter?
Because there were a few more cases discussed and investigated, but the Supreme Court had put such an interpretation on the law that basically emptied it from meaning only in very extreme cases. I think it's very important to understand that...
Like the Blatnik case.
Like the Barenblatt case, actually the Supreme Court overturned after he was sentenced for 5 years in the district court. The Supreme Court said, we cannot judge this person, and basically exonerated him or
acquitted him?
Acquitted him, yes. He ended up moving to West Germany, like many of the kapos did, who stood trial. Yes, but the Supreme Court basically said, look, only in cases of really extreme cases should we put victims on trials. What's really important to understand is that victims who have power can at times use their power in inappropriate ways, and there were such cases. So we must understand that the issue of victims is much more complex than just seeing them all as heroes. And the first, of course, to point this out was Primo Levi in his book, The Gray Zone, where he discusses the complexity of being a victim, mostly among functionaries, and he points at them. He says we cannot judge them, but we must evaluate them. And there are people who had done horrendous things. And in these Kapo trials, there was one case, which is probably the most extreme case of a case that took place in a work camp in Poland, and in which a group of kapos beat to death 8 to 12, the numbers vary, of Jews with metal rods. 2 of these kapos stood trial in separate trials in Israel. They were not convicted for the murder of their fellow Jews because there were no certificates and there were no direct eyewitnesses. Only the screaming was heard in the camp. But there's no doubt that they actually, in their own hands, had murdered these Jews with no German sight. The Germans were not within the camp. It was late at night. And they were sentenced to, one of them to 6.5 years, and then that was reduced to 5 years, and the other was sentenced to a couple of years. I don't remember the exact number, but they basically were convicted for beating their fellow Jews.
I'd like to follow up on that issue of evidence, really, because can you describe really in broad strokes how the prosecution process went? How were the defendants identified? How was the case prepared? How were the witnesses tracked down? How was all the evidence collected? And did it really hold water? Because it was mainly, I'm assuming, hearsay, right?
I wouldn't say it was hearsay. It would begin with hearsay, but police had a special unit, which would later be the unit that would develop into the one that would investigate Eichmann, the 06 unit. But it began with hearsay, and as I said, people identified their local tester or the person from the Jewish police on the street in Israel and would go to the police. Police would then investigate, would call in witnesses, and would conduct a real investigation. Now, there was no paper trail, of course. There were only testimonies. And in some cases, those testimonies turned out to be very problematic because the victims could see only their immediate superiors, but they could not see beyond that to the Germans above them. And in that sense, in some of the cases, as the court would find, these were wrongful accusations. The most interesting case being the case of Raya Hannes, who was accused by survivors that she was harsh and she was cruel. And the court found that she had done that mostly so as to show the Germans that she's cruel and harsh, but in fact, in a very secret way would help prisoners in the camps. And she did this in a very sophisticated way. She had to show harshness towards the prisoners so the Germans would trust her and do good in a very clandestine manner. So I would say that not one case in all of these trials did anyone admit to wrongdoing. None of these functionaries admitted to anything wrong. They all argued that they did this under duress, but the court, based on at times 10, 15 witnesses, came in many cases to a different conclusion, and rightfully so, I believe.
Was it difficult to recruit the witnesses, so many of them? Because I'm trying to think what you're saying here really ties into our perception of, that there was some sort of conspiracy of silence around the Holocaust in the early years, in the 1950s. There was a taboo issue that was rarely talked about. And then the Eichmann trial came and everything, all hell broke loose, quite literally. And that view has been somewhat discredited by historians for a long time, and I'm thinking that your study further discredits that notion.
Definitely. The newspapers mostly had reports about what was going on in the courts, and people would go to the court and listen to the cases, mostly people from the town or the camp in which was discussed in the case. But there were at times also, there began some editorials to develop around this, and also, not surprisingly, there were also even theater pieces written about it and performed in the Kameri and other major theaters in Israel. And I believe that the theater and the culture that developed around the collaborators and the need for vengeance basically helped reshape in some way and form the perception of Jews as collaborators.
Can you tell us a bit about similar processes abroad? You talk briefly about the so-called honor courts in the DP camps and elsewhere, but also many of these kapos ended up elsewhere in the world.
True. Well, in Europe, there were several trials that took place, including against Jews. In Poland, there was a state court and a community court. There were courts in military cases in France, in Holland, in Italy. And in the DP camps, the Jews who had just been released and gathered and in these DP camps also had this issue of people wanting revenge against their tormentors. So they established courts which were not primarily aimed at collaborators. They were courts for any infringement of the law that took place in the camps, but they also discussed cases related to collaboration, and people would then be prosecuted, and they would usually not send people to jail. They did not have that authority, but rather they would issue social verdicts. So, for example, a person would be banned from the community for a certain period of time, or not allowed to take a position as a leader in the community, or their name would be published in one of the Yiddish newspapers that came out of the DP camp berating his behavior during the war. Rarely, if at all, there were cases where people were jailed for their actions. And I follow one of these, or actually two of them, who stood trial in Europe in DP camps in one case, and in another case in a Polish state court, and then arrive in Israel and stand trial here. And we can see the shifts and turns and different views of those cases as they move from Europe to Israel, as they move from immediately after the war to 10 or 15 years after the war.
Because of the changing perception of the responsibility of Jews vis-a-vis the Nazis?
Correct. And also because here we have a factor of, at least in one of the two cases that I follow, the Ballenblatt case, which I mentioned earlier, I believe there's a factor of the Zionist young prosecutor who sees the exiled Jew and believes he has to give him a harsher treatment, and because he is Zionist, he knows that those exiled Jews had, in his perception, not in his words, actually betrayed the nation.
Right. Have any of these kapos been interviewed by anyone, historian or not, trying to understand their perception, their version of the events?
Well, we need to understand that Israel placed on trial approximately 40 people. There were hundreds of them, and most of them were not found guilty, and most of them were not cruel, and some of them were even heroic. As I mentioned, the Eichmann trial the prosecutor Hausner brings in tries to reshape the view of Jewish collaborators and functionaries in the war, and he brings to the stand a few of these kapos, and they have done, for example, Vera Alexander, who was a kapo, I believe, in Bergen-Belsen, and who saved people. So we do hear their story, and there were many so to call and good kapos. I think the majority were fair and trustworthy, but there was the minority. So we're talking about the minority. This should be very clear, a very small minority. There was a case of one Ballenblatt, again, I return to him, who was interviewed. There are excerpts of videos, but I was unable to get the full video of Ballenblatt.
Why did it take so long for Ballenblatt to stand trial? That was in the mid-60s, right?
Right. He just made Aliyah in 1959 from Poland, I believe. Yes, from Poland. And therefore it took some time. He actually was warned not to make Aliyah, that people here remembered his so-called bad deeds in Europe. But he decided to do that and was prosecuted.
It seems to me like, these people that you're describing in the book are, in a way, a mirror image or a flip side of the righteous among the nations, in the way that they are people who reacted to the impossible nature of the events, of the situation, pretty much in the way that Primo Levi described it in the book that you mentioned. They reacted to that impossible situation in an extreme manner, either by risking their lives excessively or by showing excessive amount of violence and cruelty. But one group, of course, was vindicated by history and the other indicted, both literally and metaphorically. Well, what do you have to say about that?
It's an interesting point. I will put it this way. Again, I believe that most of these kapos and the Jewish functionaries in Europe were not cruel and did not overuse their power. Most Jews wanted to become kapos and wanted to become Jewish functionaries because that was, for a certain time, that would save their families from deportation, that would give them better food portions, that would give them other benefits that would help them survive. So it's very normal and acceptable to understand that people went and sought these positions, and in that way I would not contrast the majority of the functionaries to the righteous among the nation. Now, there were a minority, like in any society, there would be a minority that takes advantage of their power in inappropriate and immoral ways. And there were cases among these 40 people who used their power for sexual advantages among teenagers. So I don't think that the contrast is fair, with all due respect, because it was the way to save yourself. And most of them acted in appropriate and did not misuse their power or did not act in immoral ways.
All right, Professor Dan Porat, historian at the Fox School of Education at the Hebrew University and the author of the recently published Bitter Reckoning, Israel Tries Holocaust Survivors as Nazi Collaborators. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thanks.
And also many thanks to Itai Shelem in Georgia Foskarini, our producers, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. Please support us on Patreon and write us a review on iTunes or whatever app you're using to listen to this podcast. Follow us on Facebook, follow me and Dalia on Twitter, and join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.